Hello, I'm Josephine Burton and welcome back to the Dash Arts podcast, seeing the world through an artistic lens. After 2 years of planning, Dash Arts is finally in the midst of building the world of Middlemarch. If you follow our work, you'll have seen glimpses of the design ideas, images of our community workshops, and more recently of the rehearsal room for our upcoming production of the Great Middlemarch Mystery. Part immersive theatre and part murder mystery adventure, our show will be on from the 7th to the 10th of April in Coventry, the UK 2022 City of Culture. George Eliot's masterpiece has so many layers to it and so much detail in it that we decided to make a podcast series about the process of creating a work of theatre from it. I've spent the last few years with many wonderful colleagues adapting the script, workshopping it in Coventry and London with actors and participants, designing it and finally now rehearsing it. This podcast will delve into the themes of the book and how they translate to live theatre, alongside interviews with the actors and the creatives behind such an ambitious undertaking. And our podcast producer, Rachel, is back to be our guide.
Thanks, Josephine. I'm excited to be back. So this episode will focus on the making of Middlemarch, the creative process that took you and Ruth from sitting down for a coffee at the British Library to kicking off rehearsals last week with 8 actors, 5 scripts, and 4 weeks to create something totally immersive. We also managed to record some fascinating footage from our community workshops in Coventry. First, though, I caught up with yourself and Professor Ruth Livesey, who is an expert on 19th century literature and an integral part of the Middlemarch process. Ruth, I would love for you to sort of tell us a little bit about your work and what you do and your sort of connection to Middlemarch, really, through that.
Sure, no problem at all, Rachel. Thanks for this and thanks for having me on. So I'm a scholar of 19th century literature, and I worked in the English department at Royal Holloway and the University of London for many years now. And George Eliot has always been an author I have loved and written about and thought about. And the story of Eliot as the woman who broke all the rules in the 19th century and transformed what we thought a work of art could be, what a novel could do, what the place of reading could be in a modern society, to me is a really compelling one still. The woman who was kind of so out of place in her own community, but went on to extraordinary success on a kind of international level, and also became very rich in the process, which is something I like sharing with students now. Yeah. You could actually get rich from writing books in those days. So what I was aware of was that 2019 was the bicentenary of George Eliot's birth, so 200 years since she was born. And as that anniversary was approaching, I was really thinking about how when it was Charles Dickens's 200th anniversary in 2012, there was massive kind of hoo-has. There were receptions at Buckingham Palace. The BFI did a special film season. The British Council had a 48-hour Dickens readathon globally across the world. And as someone who teaches Dickens and Eliot side by side, and think they're both brilliant, but in quite different ways, I thought, I wonder what they're going to do for George Eliot, who in her own day was much more esteemed than Dickens in many ways. Less popular, but more highly esteemed, I would say. But completely familiar and recognised and read and loved. And I was already getting a bit chippy about that. I thought they're not going to do anything for her because she's a woman and a bit problematic, and everyone thinks of her as serious. And she's from the Midlands, and it's not like journos can just pop down the road and go, ooh, foggy Dickensian. It's a bit harder to place her somehow and give a hook to her story. And also, she hasn't travelled out into popular culture in the same way. You know, there are hardly any film adaptations of Eliot. There's 2 really good Andrew Davies TV series. But she hasn't become kind of popular currency in the way that people will still think about Oliver Twist or other novels.
And why do you think that is?
So I had a great research assistant on the project I got funding to do in 2019, which is exploring exactly that question around the bicentenary. Why is it that Eliot, there were things for Eliot. There were conferences, academic things, organisations and museums around Nuneaton and Coventry had special displays and collections of their holdings. So it's not there was nothing about Eliot at all, but the kind of national and international traction around it was much less. And the research I did, and certainly my postdoctoral research associate Helen O'Neill did as well, really explored why that was in relation to where George Eliot stays famous. And it was quite striking that Helen did this research on the digital textual archive. So writers are still writing about George Eliot, but she hasn't travelled out into other spheres in the same way. So there are hardly any film adaptations, as I said. She's famous still, but in a very literary kind of sphere, let's put it that way. So and that kind of reflects what her writing's like. Her writing is quite intimate. it's not self-consciously theatrical in the way Dickens's is, where we know Dickens is experimenting with kind of cinematic forms, things like jump cuts and zoom in, zoom outs before there's even cinema in Dickens's work. Eliot's work is much more self-consciously about the relationship between a reader, an individual reader, and a story as it unfolds, and what novels can do that other forms of art struggle with more, such as taking you really round to see from another person's point of view, then taking you back out again. So it's this quite private, readerly relationship, and that's much more difficult to open out, especially in a world where reading a text the size of Middlemarch, got it on my shelf here, is just a real challenge to keep focus for that long period of time. So some of it's about the quality of her writing as well, the way she writes.
That's really interesting. I mean, she was referred to as a rural historian once, I think, by Henry James. But do you think it's partly due to that setting, partly it be because her work focuses on rural areas of study and provincial life, whereas Dickens is more London-based?
Yeah, Henry James's comment is a really interesting one, because that's what she got famous for with the early novels like Adam Bede, Scenes of Clerical Life, Silas Marner, set in that rural setting around the Midlands, North and Warwickshire. She was sort of very widely loved initially because she showed a world that was disappearing, that was kind of just vanishing out of sight. She was writing at the peak of the kind of railway age, massive transformations of the economy, telegraph, rapid post. But she's usually writing back about a period of history, which I've called the kind of the just past. It's only just in the past. It's only just becoming history. It's like a generation away, or your childhood memory space, so like 40 years before. So she's playing with that sense of something that's vanishing and can be captured and preserved in her writing. So, in some ways you can think of some of the descriptions of things like harvest suppers and Adam Bede as a kind of capturing of an intangible heritage, how people used to sit around a table at dinner, how they ate, the songs they sang. So she captures a world in that way. So
it's the bicentennial, nothing's happening, and you decide to make something happen?
Yeah, so really this is the joy of having coffee with someone, and where it can lead to in quite wonderfully creative and dangerous ways. So around the bicentenary, one of the things that was happening is various people saying, I think it's Eliot's bicentenary, we should do something, was that Dash had been asked or had offered, I'm not quite sure, Josephine can tell this story better than me, to put on a cafe, one of the Dash Arts cafes at Warwick Arts Centre. And through conversation there, the fact of the bicentenary and George Eliot being from Coventry, or living in Coventry a long time, being from Nuneaton, just north of there, came up. So this was the theme for a cafe. And by marvellous freak of fate, my work on Eliot, which I was doing at the time, was recommended to Josephine through a mutual friend, who's head of English at Warwick University at the time, Emma Mason. And thanks to that intro, Josephine and I had coffee at the British Library. We both had the time to do that, which is also the thing, make time to have coffee. And we just started talking.
So Josephine, back to that cafe, that first cafe that you were asked to do by Warwick Arts Centre, how did that come about? What was that for? Was that already to do with George Eliot, or was that to do with Coventry?
It was not. It was to do with Coventry. Effectively, I had a conversation with Julia Carruthers, who's the artistic director at Warwick Arts Centre, and we were discussing bringing our Dash Cafe events, which are very much like a pre-COVID thing, and we hope a post-COVID thing as well. There are these pop-up events that are very embedded in arts performance with conversation that float around it. And I was chatting to Julia about mounting a few of these cafes at the Warwick Arts Centre, and I asked Julia what would be interesting things to focus on in and around Coventry and Warwick Arts Centre in early 2020. And Julia said, it's in 2021, it's the anniversary of Middlemarch. It's the 150th anniversary of the writing of Middlemarch. And I thought, that's kind of brilliant, because I've just read Middlemarch and I'm a very late comer. I'm a real kind of late adopter to the book. I meet people all the time who've read it every year for 30 years, or keep revisiting it at really kind of important points of their life to re-understand and identify with different characters. I have to say that my first encounter with the book was probably about 4 years ago, and I kind of thought, that's interesting. And because Dash is focusing currently on what it means to be European and what we are, kind of being European in a kind of post-Brexit landscape, I I was kind of interested in how George Eliot understands the Europe and the role that Europe plays in her novels. And so I started to talk to people who might be able to introduce me to somebody who was thinking about this in their work. And I met Ruth. So Ruth and I plotted actually an event at Warwick Arts Centre, which was really specifically about George Eliot and her writing and the role of the outsider in her work. But as Ruth said, the conversation and the encounter became so much more than just setting up what might be an event that would happen 6 months later at Warwick Arts Centre. It was a sunny day. We sat in the courtyard of the British Library, and Ruth started to tell me about her work. And it appealed to so much. There was so much synergy in the ideas that Ruth was focusing on with the work that Dash does. And I think I should probably explain that a bit, because I think it gives you a really good context for the production. Alongside the cafes and alongside the occasional large-scale international show that Dash has made over the last 16 years of its existence, we also have something that we call the Dash Residence, which is a world that pops up. It started when we were working with artists from across the former Soviet Union, when we built a Russian country house which looked beautiful and was very evocative, and there was a samovar boiling in the corner of the room, and the audience walked in, and there was music to listen to, and they could get involved in the cooking, and they can get involved in the kind of playing chess and creating the world with us. And it was partly performance based and partly an art installation. It's a really beautiful world. The audience are as equal and as important as the artists. We move the set together, we cook together, we perform together, we dance, we jam, and it's really the community that makes the show. We need the audience, we need the volunteers, and we need the performers all together in the mix to build our residences. And I've been thinking for a long time with my colleagues at Dash about ways in which we might be able to make new work for the residents. So we're not just building a performance space, which is gorgeous, and then doing stuff in it. But actually, there is a piece of theatre made in and for that world. So that's sort of been a kind of a question mark for me at the back of my mind that's been kind of bubbling along for a few years. And then Ruth told me about George Eliot and her writing. And I had read it and encountered it myself, but it was so helpful hearing Ruth explain, really, that it's the whole community, particularly in Middlemarch, which is so vital. And as Ruth kind of subsequently counted, there are more than 90 named people in Middlemarch. George Eliot builds the town. She has the townspeople, she has the local politics, she has all the doctors, she has all of the coroners and all the tradespeople, all the friends of all the guests who, there is just it's an extraordinary picture she builds. And ultimately it's all of those people, all of the characters that play a role in bringing about the action in Middlemarch. It's not just the few key parts, it's the community. And listening to Ruth talk about George Eliot and the kind of world building that she does in her books sort of really struck a chord for me with the way that we go about building our worlds for Dash, performing arts worlds. So that was that encounter, that moment. And it was really at that very moment at that coffee when we sort of said, well, let's do it. Let's try and create the world of Middlemarch and tell the story in a theatrical way. It was really important from the outset that it would be about the community and the world of Middlemarch rather than trying to, with some difficulty, as Ruth was just articulating, adapt the book itself into a traditional play.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible jumping off point, but then what has been created, like you say, is it's not a straight play, we should say right now. It's an immersive world that spans Coventry city centre. Was the decision to do something like that quite early on?
We didn't know exactly how we would tell it immediately. We came into it really quite open to what might happen, and then lockdown happened. So we were going to start working in April because I think there was a little bit of money that was left over from the AHLC funding, I think, if I'm remembering that right. So we could start, but we were entirely on Zoom. It was Ruth and myself and Christina, who's our producer, and Brian, who's the associate designer in Australia, all regularly meeting and reading bits and analysing the characters and thinking about how we might tell stories without really knowing how. And then I think slowly over the course of those conversations and those funny little Zoom encounters, it started to become very clear that we would be telling the story across different places. We found particular spaces that we loved: the community of the mayor's wife's living room, the bank itself where the banker Mr. Bulstrode works, the pub which is such an important part of there. And there are several pubs in Middlemarch, but we focused on the Green Dragon because the Green Dragon has a totally fantastic gossiping, I don't want to say bullying, domineering landlady who is a real character. And so the Green Dragon came about. And so we slowly started to think, well, we can tell the story of Middlemarch through the prism of several different spaces that existed in the book.
Yeah, and I think that was really important for me to understand this kind of theatre making as well, that as soon as Josephine started telling me about the Dash residencies, I immediately was imagining what Middlemarch would be like and how that experience of participating in these quite intimate domestic scenes and being in the middle of the action was such a beautiful mirror for how Eliot's novels work, but in a very, very different way. So a very true theatrical reimagining of the experience of reading one of her novels, where you're literally in the thick of the action and you can't separate yourself from these characters, but giving that to our audience members, and definitely not through a traditional mode of theatre making, a kind of traditional format play. So that was really liberating as well, that we freed ourselves from plot to some extent. And I think that's great, because one of the problems with Eliot's novels and the wonders of Eliot's novels is her endings are always really a bit annoying, that she doesn't give you a kind of a wonderful kind of lift where everyone's happily ever after, or there's everything's wrapped up at the end. You know, so the ending of Middlemarch is about a kind of saying, well, the fates are kind of incalculably diffusive, that we can't really put a name to great achievements. And it's a very dispersed kind of ending, and that seemed really true to this idea of kind of moving between these different spaces and sites across Coventry and experiencing some of Middlemarch as we've reimagined it, but always with we have given something for people to pursue through that story as well. We realise we need to give our audiences a bit of a task, which has been one of the fun bits of reminding readers who even know this novel really, really well that there is actually a murder in the story as well, and that becomes the heart of what we do. But just to give a little bit more context to what Josephine says, I mean, my original research around the bicentenary was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and that was exploring this idea of middleness, as I called it. So Middlemarch is a novel set in the Midlands, literally in the middle of England is how it imagines itself, and how Eliot kind of evokes this idea of a Middle England. And what on earth Middle England might be now, what it was then, is it sits so snugly with Dash's kind of creative work as well over many, many years, and how Middle England can treat the outsider, which again is part of that storytelling in the novel. We see settlers coming from afar, moving into the town, and they don't always do well in that middling sort of provincial town that we see in that novel. So again, we're teasing out some of the difficulties and complexities of being an outsider in a community like that as well, in the way we've brought forward certain parts of the story. But I think it is the richness of Eliot that in some ways she wants to undo the whole idea of heroes and heroines who should be the focus of our attention and should carry the whole story. So the kind of the thickness of the world we've built really reflects that side of the novel that's easily overlooked in other kinds of adaptations.
That's so true. What was really fun is that we've ended up focusing on the character of Ladislav, the journalist who's really going out, wants to save the world. He wants, he's pushing for change. He wants to kind of fight corruption. He wants to expose a whole lot of bad work going on, bad deeds going on locally. And he really believes in the power of journalism to make a change in a community. And we weren't really going to include him at all in our show. And I think he only arrived towards the end of 2021. He just suddenly he became an important person for us quite late in the process. And I think that's lovely, because I'm not sure, he is obviously, to many people who did watch the Andrew Davies adaptation, he's played by Rufus Sewell, and everyone has a crush on Rufus Sewell. So he has a kind of an important role in that adaptation, but he's not a major player in some ways, not as like Dorothea, for example, or Dr. Lydgate, for those who know the book. So that was kind of lovely, that going through this process with Ruth and really trying to look at who were important players for us, and who could kind of help build the texture of the show, enabled us to look at Ladislav in a way that we hadn't really before.
Well, looking at all the characters with a slightly different framework, because we should say that instead of being set in the 1880s, the show is set in the 1980s.
Yes, the 1980s thing came really late in the process, and it's important to sort of know why, actually. I mean, when we were doing that early work on Zoom, we kept acknowledging that there were some characters who felt more contemporary and some who felt more traditional. So we thought for a while of making the show quite timeless. We could keep some of the more fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned characters in the 19th century. There was the character of Dr. Lydgate, who is this doctor who's fighting for change. Really spoke to us as a doctor who maybe have come in as an economic migrant to work in the UK, potentially from a country that is in the former British Empire, who comes in as an outsider and deals with outsiderness. And that felt we could look at it that role in different ways, through different generations and so on. So we kind of sat there thinking, well, maybe we will not be time specific in our show. We also had Brian saying, please don't make this a 19th century period piece because the costumes are going to be so expensive.
Good point.
That was also running through our mind. But there is something else which happened, which has kind of helped us with the time, which is that we went into our first workshop in September 2020, and it was just miraculous because it was pretty much the first time that anyone had seen anyone since before COVID. And we went in we decided we were going to focus on Mrs. Vincey, the mayor's wife's all of the action that we could potentially relocate and put in her living room. We decided we'd take, and we literally stripped chapters from the book, stuck them into bound them up, stuck them into a pack in kind of chronological order, and went into the rehearsal room with a whole bunch of people who had never read George Eliot before and read for the week. We just literally read it and then thought about how we would kind of devise around that scene. So, how we could look at that scene in a different way in that space. And it was a hard process. It was quite difficult, but it was so valuable. And what came out of that immersion with her text, with these brilliant actors, was realizing that we loved her language. We wanted to keep quite a lot of her language, particularly the dialogue that she builds between the characters. And it was really important for us to keep quite a lot of that beautiful 19th century conversation. That was the first thing. The second thing is we really needed a script. We didn't know at that point, I don't think until that point, we weren't sure there would be a script because we were thinking so much about building worlds where there's so much improvisation that has to happen because the audience are part of the experience. The audience are sitting having a cup of tea next to the mayor's wife and making polite, silly conversation about, gossip in town. You can't really script that because it happens in the moment. We realised that we needed a script as well because there were the key, gorgeous moments of romance, of kind of challenge that were in her book that we wanted to preserve. So we then, Ruth and I, came away thinking, okay, well, we're going to have to start to write a script. And we started to sort of strip away so much of this extraordinary text and form a script for that living room. And realising that it couldn't all be 19th century language, and working out between us what bits we wanted to keep that would be slightly jarring and potentially slightly unfamiliar to 21st century audiences, and which bits we needed to tweak and adapt. So that kind of helped us lead the decisions around time, I would say.
And part of it was in that first workshop, there was a moment where we'd done a lot of improvisation, but then there was a large speech from towards the end of the action where Lydgate kind of accuses the town of having excluded him, where our fantastic actor who was taking part in the workshop just went from the script. And it was really astonishing. It was so moving. It was so compelling. It was so completely something that made sense and would resonate with audiences now. And for me, it was that revelation of saying, yes, you give a good actor a script. And we've seen this as we've moved into later stages more recently. And it can take you somewhere, if we're still using Shakespearean text, and there's no reason why Eliot's text can't still carry that kind of connection and emotion and truth about humanity and the human condition that is somehow timeless. And interestingly, I think in our thinking, once we'd decided on a script that was somehow true to the language of Eliot, it then became much easier to make this later move that just came upon us in a production meeting where we were thinking about the time setting and when we would set the play, because somehow once the language is there that speaks of Eliot, the kind of all the mise en scène or the costumes and the kind of the other bits of setting that says this is a 19th century text doesn't somehow matter as much. Actually, what matters is the timelessness of the kind of the humanism of Eliot's storytelling and the beauty of her language.
And why the 80s?
Yeah, I think it was I mean, it was so live. We just started having a conversation and it was like, how about, I don't know, I think I just said, how about we just do it like this? Because Eliot, as I said, Eliot sets her own works nearly always, and especially Middlemarch, it's really explicit, really carefully set against the calendar. Her research notes show this. About 40 years before she was writing. And she's really thought hard about what this means. And the narrator comes in and tells us why it matters, because it's a time of change. The railways are just coming to the city. Things are much slower at that time because communications are just changing. The city's the trade's being really affected by new trade deals with Europe, basically. So there's an economic downturn. And I was thinking, well, if we set it in Coventry, a fictionalized version of Coventry 40 years before where we are now, where do we get to? We get to 1982, which in so many ways resonates with the bigger historical story that Eliot's saying. She's writing about a time of massive economic restructuring. What happens in 1982-83? It's the peak. It's the year of 3 million unemployed. It's the year when Coventry newspapers have all these headlines about businesses closing. We know from the original story that Mr. Vincey's in hock to his brother-in-law because of the turn in his trade. There's a lot of economic anxiety that pervades Middlemarch as well. Then in the 1980s, again, this whole sense of with the boom of the financial industries and the decline in manufacturing, a lot of attention shifts to London, a much more kind of London financial market world and a cultural world as well. A lot of kind of sucking out of energy from provincial towns. Again, we see this part of the backstory of Middlemarch. Eliot's talking about a time where smaller Midlands town had a much more self-confident sense of identity, whereas in the time she's writing, a lot of that's ebbed away, and it seems to be a much more London-centred world and kind of cosmopolitan world that she's writing about. So in all kinds of ways, basically, there are many, many resonances with that. For us, the huge shift, obviously, is to a digital world. From a pre-digital world. And I haven't yet shared this with Josephine, but I've been playing around with some of the newspapers we're creating for the thing. And yeah, after a conversation, thinking about the work of a professor at Coventry University, pinpointing the fact that our more progressive newspaper has just moved from hot metal type to cut and paste and computation, and what's going to happen to the old printing jobs. Again, so there's all kinds of communication revolutions going on. We've decided that the intercity high-speed rail is coming to Middlemarch in our story. And obviously in Eliot's novel, it's the first railway line connecting Middlemarch to London and Brassing. Birmingham's called Brassing.
Picking up on what Ruth is saying here, as part of the research and creative process for the show, it was really important that we heard real stories about what Coventry was like in the 80s. Here's a clip from one of our recent workshops where we hear first-hand experiences of those times.
I moved to Coventry in the 80s, 85. Things that stuck out in my mind was, and I know they sung about it, didn't they, the specials, there was a lot of violence in the city. You go to the pub and there would be stabbings and people, and glasses, people were being glassed. It was quite violent, and you'd be sitting there going, oh, something's kicking off, and then you'll just move on. It was almost like accepted. Nowadays it'd be horrified, but it was quite violent. And the big thing I remember was on the buses, because I'm from Liverpool, which is rough anyway, and I came to Coventry, and the buses, they had the perspex screen between the driver and the passengers. They didn't have that up north. It was like, what's this? And it was to protect the drivers from being stabbed.
Well, you jumped on the back of the bus sometimes.
And you couldn't, because of that, you couldn't get change for a tenner. Again, we could do that before. Always in Coventry, you always have to have the right change on the bus, and it was just, silly little things that you notice that why is that different from elsewhere? And I think it was the violence.
You have to sort of assume it was because of politics at the time and upheaval and change, lots of unemployment.
Yeah, definitely. Just the culture at the time.
Football violence, isn't there?
Football violence, but I mean, there was also like a change in sort of like the youth culture as well, due to the fact that there was like the revival of the mods and rocker scene, that sort of idea. Because I was like 16 at the time. And it was a case of you suddenly joining with a crowd of guys that are all wearing parkas, and we've sort of got boating jackets on. We come down the town, we're singing, we are the Muds, and we're outside Sainsbury's. There's a group of about 16 of us scaring the hell out of people because all we're shouting is, we are the Muds.
In Coventry?
In Coventry, yeah. And, I had my head kicked in by a bunch of skinheads one afternoon because my girlfriend was poking fun at them. At that time, my musical taste changed completely. I'd gone from sort of like just listening to whatever was on the radio, and then you suddenly get channeled into this thing of listening to Quadrophenia and The Jam and other bands that were around that era trying to get into that sort of scene. And it's really strange how that one film and that album and the words from that album of Quadrophenia seem to have stuck with me and changed how I was from being this kid with specs to being this guy that suddenly thought, yeah, I can join in and I can be part of a group. And, you know, and yeah, we had rumours of guys walking around town with Stanley knives that scared the hell out of you. But you could still go to the Polish club at night and have a disco. We got kicked out of the Bug and Black Bat for dancing on the tables. It was bad, but good. Yeah, things change.
George Eliot did base, and maybe we said this at the beginning, George Eliot based Middlemarch on Coventry. It is in some ways the story of a version of Coventry, and we are retelling that story of a version of Coventry through our show.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how, in a way, how little work there is kind of mapping Middlemarch onto that period of Coventry's actual history. So Eliot was at school at Coventry in the period in which the novel's set. So she did know a lot about the local politics and the gossip and the work around the hospital that was really happening in Coventry in the period in which she set it. And when she was researching the background for the novel, she was still in touch with old friends in the city and wrote and got great gossipy notes about the scandal at the hospitals that was going on, about, you can see from the way that she describes the mayor and so on, she's got someone particular in mind. And I've got another part of the funding I've got from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, running a little project trying to find the real Middlemarch in the history of Coventry, which kind of runs alongside this, because I'm sure there's more we can uncover in relation to that real history, if you like, that she was playing around with. So for Eliot, Middlemarch was and was not Coventry. She got quite burned early in her career by making her use of real people's stories just a bit too recognisable. It's how her identity was discovered. So she writes under, obviously, George Eliot's a pseudonym, a pen name she took up when she started publishing, but it was only a couple of years later that the story she told in Adam Bede and Scenes of Clerical Life was so close to the actual historical knowledge about families and gossip around Nuneaton, where her family were living, that it was kind of worked out eventually that she, scandalous woman who'd left to go to London, was living unmarried to another man.
And what is her real name?
Mary Ann Evans, or Marianne. When she moved to London, she decided she's going to be Marianne because it sounded a bit more glamorous. I think we can all relate to that.
Bringing us slightly more up to the present day, we have, after that first encounter with Mrs. Vincey and Mrs. Vincey's living room, we then moved on to looking at the bank and building a similar script for the bank. And over the last year, we have written the Green Dragon pub script and the town hall. So basically, Ruth and I have spent, I suppose, 18 months building and writing scripts for 5 different locations across Middlemarch. And they are going to run simultaneously. So that it's not going to be a case of the audience having a kind of guided tour around, having a scene here and then a scene there, and maybe the scenes repeat. It's going to run in real time from the moment the show starts to it ends, and there will be kind of for the full length of the performance, there will be activity happening, drama unfolding, gossip being spilt in each of the 5 locations. And that was a very interesting kind of moment in our process too, to work through, because there will be kind of key moments of drama that will happen in each of those places. I mean, I don't want to give it all away, but like there will be something interesting, important, big that will happen for the characters at different points in different places. And we needed to build a sort of a script that would like not encourage FOMO, so that you wouldn't feel really frustrated that you'd missed out on that moment because you were having a really nice time in a bank training to be a bank clerk, or you were knitting with a whole bunch of brilliant people in the town hall, or you were running around with a journalist with your pad trying to take notes on what else was going on. I mean, and conducting interviews, because that will be available to you as an audience member anywhere. And we've had to think through how to enable people to know they're going to have a phenomenal time wherever they are. We've been employing different ways to do that. One of those is that you will hear about the action and the drama in every location you're at. So although you might miss that key moment, you will hear about it in a different way in different places in really fun ways. So wherever you encounter the drama, it will be entertaining and interesting and creative and different. And also we're doing something quite unusual in that is that we're enabling our audience who will step over the threshold at the start of the show and become part of Middlemarch. They will choose to become the journalists, the bank clerks, the doctors, the medical students, the tradespeople. They will choose that role. And they will have free rein to make their own route across Middlemarch, to stay for as long as they want in the pub, or to stay for as long as they want at the mayor's house drinking tea or taking out money in the bank. And if they want to follow someone who's really interesting, out a character, Dr. Lydgate on his rounds, if they want to leave the bank and follow Dr. Lydgate and see where he goes, that's completely fine for them. And that feeling of that empowerment that we're going to give the audience to make their own decisions, to travel through Middlemarch in their own way, I think will do a lot to offset the kind of concern that they might have that they might have missed something.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly complicated, but it's also so very true to the experience of reading this particular novel as well, in which there is so much going on, and different characters' life stories are always put in parallel to each other. Three love problems, the two people waiting for someone to die. So wherever you look, there are multiple examples of what it's like to experience something, and multiple points of view on action as well. And the novel takes us to those points of view. And Middlemarch, of course, was also a novel that people do return to across their lives, and just see completely different things in each time. And I wonder if in honour of that, we should just try and get someone to come to all performances of the Great Middlemarch Mystery and take an entirely different route each time, and kind of experience it. You could come 5 times and just have a completely different experience of the story each time.
Yeah, I sort of described it as a choose your own adventure.
That's exactly what it is. And really, they'll have a hand in it, because it's, as Ruth was alluding to, there is a murder, and it is the responsibility and the role of our audience to kind of find out who did it and why, and gather clues and pick up physical evidence that they come across on the way, and then share it at the end of the show as part of the kind of revealing of the plot. There's another side to the show, of course, which is really important, which comes back to the point that we had at the beginning of the conversation about the fact that it's the world of Middlemarch. It's not just the few key people, it's the community. And I'm grateful to the enormous and wonderful support that we have for the show. It's extraordinarily generous, but it would never be quite enough to enable us to afford a cast of 90-something actors. So we are privileged to be working in a different way, which is alongside our professional cast of 8. We're also building a cast of middle people, really significant roles who play kind of significant community roles across all the locations. And they are brilliant, wonderful individuals based in and around Coventry who are part of our performance. They will be bank clerks, they will be deputy editors of the papers, they will be loan sharks and auctioneers and PAs. And they will be joining us through the rehearsals, and they will be in the show, some of whom will have spoken roles, and some of them will have kind of more stewarding roles or kind of world building roles. And we're currently, alongside the rehearsals, running workshops in and around Coventry with these non-professional, brilliant, theatre-loving, community-loving individuals who will be part of our show.
The brothers burst in.
No, handsome though.
Very handsome, smart, the pair of them.
I'm running a book on it.
What's that, Bam?
Well, I'm taking bets on the Dots are getting engaged to Rosamund Vincy. The flower of Middlemarch. Stands to reason, the two of them. Meeting every day alone. Her distraught about her brother's illness. He's coming with all those fancy foreign notions and treatments. Quite intimate, I hear they are now.
He could never afford to keep her. Not the way she's been brought up.
Well, that's ever got in the way of two young people in love.
Said, Ruth, that people identify with the characters of Middlemarch. And I just found that really interesting, because obviously the characters in our Middlemarch, in this Middlemarch that you've created, are, they're very real. They're complex and catty and snide and jealous. And those same people are also very warm and lovely and funny. Who do you identify with?
Well, from our cast, from the characters we have in Middlemarch, I think it probably would be Mrs. Bulstrode, or at least I admire her the most, because she loves her fashion. She's quite worldly. She loves a good gossip, but would never admit to it, and tries not to be judgy, but is quite judgy, and thinks of herself as very pious and religious, but actually also has some very worldly, practical points of view about getting on in life. But she experiences a terrible misfortune in the course of the play, and comes out of the novel actually as one of the most faithful hearts, I suppose I would say, in the play. And she embodies a kind of a spirit of faith and goodness that is quite rare in the novel. I say my favourite characters are one we haven't been able to put in our version. And there's an even cattier gossip called Mrs. Cadwallader. Mrs. Cadwallader, who's basically a wonderful kind of nosy, snobby busybody who, tries to get everyone to do what she wants them to do and doesn't succeed very well, but always says, I knew this was going to happen. And as I've got older, I've identified with her much more. But we won't say any more about that.
I'm sorry we can't have her in, but she's from the country set. And the other person who's from the country set is Dorothea. And whenever I tell people we've adapted Middlemarch and we haven't included Dorothea, it's such sacrilege, because she is the heroine she's the heroine to end all heroines in some ways in the novel, in British novels. She's an extraordinary individual.
So is she the person that you identify with then?
Oh no, I think I could only dream of identifying with her. I think I might identify. I love Ladislav just because he's he's so determined, and he's absolutely kind of clear that he's not going to be swayed in his vision. It's kind of quite extraordinary. I have admiration for that. I think I identify with Dr. Lydgate, who is totally flawed. He's a flawed individual. He's compassionate and really wants to change the world and goes about it in all the wrong ways. But his heart is in the right place, I feel like. And he's a flawed individual, and we all are. So I think I feel for him. Right now I'm recording this in digs in Coventry, coming to the end of our first week of rehearsals. I'm just back from a stumbling run through of all the scenes that unfold in Mr. Bulstrode's bank with our amazing cast. We made it just about through to the end, which was pretty remarkable, incorporating our script packed with George Eliot's original language alongside a lot of improv with our middle people and audiences. All the workshops we've run in Coventry with our middle people, including one last night in the studio, has totally informed this improvised conversation. I brought into the rehearsal room a brilliant story that was shared with us about dancing on the tables in Coventry pubs in the 80s and late nights in music clubs. And I know we have much, much more to come next week. I just need to find some time for a little more sleep first.
Thanks for listening to the Dash Arts podcast, and thank you to the incredible speakers, Professor Ruth Livesey, Josephine Burton, and all our community participants. Next time, we'll be diving deeper into the themes of George Eliot's Middlemarch and hearing from some of our actors about the process. Please see all details for how to book the show on our website. To play us out today, I've got a clip from one of our workshops where we encouraged a little bit of improv. I'm Rachel Head. Thank you for listening.
Talking about people having no underwear on, I heard a little story the other day. You know Cynthia, Cecilia's mum. Well, she works in the De Vere Hotel there. And the other night she was doing the chambermaid and around the rooms, and she sees Mick Jagger running naked down the hallway, holding his tickle tackle like this. Please let me in, Jagger. Yeah, she's let him in the room. Mick Jagger? He didn't even give her a tip or anything. Oh, Charlie. Tight gear. What was he doing in Coventry anyway? Twice that. Too busy focused on the tickle tackle. Tickle tackle. Well, was it a bit small?